Welcome back to our channel. Today we're delving into the life of a man who was once considered Hollywood's reigning Adonis, a star whose face alone could light up an entire theater, but whose private world was riddled with self-doubt, public scrutiny, and an almost constant need to please others. This is the story of Robert Taylor. He was tall, handsome, and debonair, with a voice that dripped warmth and gentle courtesy. But behind that carefully sculpted image lay a complicated figure caught in the fray of Hollywood politics, the pressures of a watchful studio system, the swirl of rumors about his personal life, and the stigmas of a turbulent era. Robert Taylor was born on August 5, 1911, as Spangler Arlington Brugh, the only child of a country doctor and a dedicated homemaker. Life in small-town America wasn't particularly glamorous, yet in some ways it laid an emotional foundation that would follow him forever. During those early years, Taylor would have seen firsthand the grit and generosity of everyday Midwestern life, neighbors helping neighbors, routines shaped by the cycles of nature, and a sense of communal closeness. His father, Dr. Spangler Andrew Brugh, carried the weight of caring for patients scattered across miles of farmland, often traveling by horse and buggy in the earliest days of his medical practice. Meanwhile, his mother, Ruth Adeline, was a nurturing presence described by acquaintances as gentle but reserved, a characteristic some say Robert Taylor mirrored in his adult life. While the environment was modest and rural, there's no question that the seeds of his future identity took root here. A calm and courteous demeanor, an internal drive for acceptance, and that quiet strength he later projected on screen. When young Spangler was 7 years old, his family relocated to an area where his father found a more stable practice. For a time they lived in places like Beatrice, Nebraska, then moved on to other Midwestern towns. Through these transitions, Taylor cultivated an interest in music, particularly the cello. Accounts vary on exactly when he took it up, but he reportedly displayed an early knack for it, earning him a small but meaningful local reputation as a talented young musician. This was the first clue that he might have a performance side lurking beneath his calm facade. By the time he reached his late teens, Spangler had grown tall, broad-shouldered, with a certain elegance that stood out even in casual settings. At Pomona College in California, he pursued his love for music more seriously, intending at one point to become a professional cellist. The discipline required to excel in music paralleled the discipline of an acting career. Hours upon hours of practice, a willingness to hone details, and that intangible emotional quality that sets true performers apart. Whether he knew it or not, all of this would shape the presence he'd eventually bring to the screen. In the early 1930s, the world was changing fast. The Great Depression was in full swing, leaving many Americans feeling economically desperate and socially uncertain. And yet, Hollywood offered refuge. People flocked to the movies, craving an escape from real-world hardships. The film industry was undergoing its own transformation too, as talkies replaced silent films, and studios like MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and RKO consolidated power, controlling everything from star contracts to distribution. It was an era of lavish musicals, social comedies, screwball romances, and the blossoming potential of the silver screen. It was during this time that Spangler Arlington Brugh inadvertently took a step that would thrust him onto that screen and ultimately reshape his identity. The specifics of how he was discovered vary by account. One story claims that a talent scout saw him in a school play, impressed by both his stage presence and good looks. Another says he was coaxed into a minor film role by an acquaintance who thought he had the right look. However it happened, once MGM got wind of him, they wasted no time. Like a potter with fresh clay, the studio sought to mold him into a bankable star. Gone was the unassuming Spangler Arlington Brugh. Enter Robert Taylor, a name that from MGM's vantage point captured the all-American suavity they felt was perfect for the big screen. Those were the early days of what's often called the studio system, a time when moguls like Louis B. Mayer prided themselves on building Hollywood's greatest entertainment empires. Actors under long-term contracts were protected yet tightly controlled. MGM famously bragged it had more stars than there are in heaven, and Robert Taylor soon counted himself among them. In short order, he was pegged for a big promotional push, playing romantic leads in shimmering black and white films that left audiences swooning over his gentle gaze and cultured baritone voice. Yet from the outset, there were quiet rumblings that all was not well behind those photogenic smiles. Some insiders whispered that young Taylor felt perpetually anxious, a bit insecure despite his good looks and blossoming fame, possibly weighed down by a contract that required him to do the studio's bidding, on set and off. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. At first, his trajectory seemed a dream come true. Taylor's earliest notable appearances included small parts in RKO and MGM productions, quickly leading to a breakthrough role in Magnificent Obsession, 1935. He was cast opposite Irene Dunne, and the film's success rocketed him from near unknown to one of Hollywood's newest heartthrobs. Reviewers drooled over his performance, describing him as a fresh-faced newcomer with an almost angelic beauty. Shortly after, he solidified his place in MGM's firmament by starring alongside Greta Garbo in Camille, 1936, delivering a performance lauded for both tenderness and on-screen chemistry. In that golden moment, fans couldn't get enough of him. Movie magazines gushed over the perfect profile, and thousands of letters poured into MGM's mailroom. Yet within this swirl of adoration, seeds of personal conflict began to sprout. Taylor was known to confide in close friends that he often felt overshadowed by the marketing machine. He understood that he was more a product than a person in the eyes of the studio. The boy from Nebraska, who once dreamed simply of playing the cello, was now a major commodity. His entire public image carefully curated by publicists who told him where to be, how to pose, and what to say. The question of authenticity would dog him for the rest of his life. For audiences who came of age in the golden age of Hollywood, roughly the 1930s through the 1950s, Robert Taylor was synonymous with elegance, class, and a certain unwavering politeness. Viewers might remember him from Waterloo Bridge, 1940, Ivanhoe, 1952, or Quo Vadis, 1951, each role showcasing his range from romantic lead to swashbuckling hero. But alongside every promotional tour and carefully orchestrated premiere, there was a sense that Taylor's career was tethered inextricably to the studio that had made him. Indeed, for an astonishing 25 years, he remained with MGM, a rarity in an industry where even top-tier stars sometimes hopped from one studio to another if the terms were right. MGM, of course, took pride in this, but make no mistake, those 25 years came at a cost. The studio had nearly absolute authority over which films he would make. They often favored roles that capitalized on his leading man aura rather than those that might stretch his acting chops in unexpected ways. Behind closed doors, this was said to be a point of frustration for Taylor, who wanted not just to be admired, but to be challenged as a performer. Occasionally, he sees an opportunity to do more nuanced work, like Johnny Eager, 1941, where he played a charming gangster capable of moral complexity. But such projects were the exception rather than the rule. Equally as orchestrated was his personal life. Under contract, an actor's romantic exploits social engagements, and even grooming habits could come under the watchful eye of the studio. Public image was everything, and if a star's real-life behavior threatened that image, the studio publicity team would scramble to keep it under wraps. Taylor, by most accounts, was easygoing, perhaps even too pliant in the eyes of some critics. He rarely fought the studio on major decisions, maintaining an aura of politeness and compliance that seemed consistent with the roles he played on screen. Some commentators have suggested that his willingness to go along with everything the studio demanded was a survival mechanism in Hollywood's cutthroat environment. Others speculate that he truly was conflict-averse and dreaded confrontation. In any case, the payoff for this cooperative stance was longevity, while other contemporary stars like Clark Gable or Spencer Tracy sometimes locked horns with MGM or negotiated different deals. Robert Taylor stayed the course. That spelled steady work and consistent pay. But ironically, it may have also limited how deeply he was respected by peers who saw him as more an icon of physical perfection than a dynamic performer or a rebellious spirit. Indeed, gossip columns occasionally described him as the nice boy next door who made it big. And yet lurking beneath the surface was a soul who never seemed entirely sure he was living life on his own terms. One of the most closely watched aspects of Taylor's life was his highly publicized marriage to Barbara Stanwyck, a star in her own right. She was known for her fiery portrayals in films such as Stella Dallas, 1937, and, a few years later, the iconic film noir Double Indemnity, 1944. When the two tied the knot in 1939, tabloids rejoiced, branding them the golden couple who radiated the best of Tinseltown. On paper, Stanwyck and Taylor appeared to complement each other. She was sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, and experienced in Hollywood's labyrinth, while he was the quieter, more introspective partner, seemingly grateful for a stable relationship to anchor him. However, the reality was more complicated. Both had come from somewhat complicated backgrounds. Stanwyck was orphaned at a young age and had navigated a tough upbringing, while Taylor was a transplant from Nebraska, thrust into the swirling intensity of Hollywood. Rumors erupted almost from day one. Some claimed it was a lavender marriage, designed to deflect questions about Taylor's sexuality, which the studios were all too eager to quash. Others suggested Stanwyck was simply too headstrong and tough, while he was too gentle and insecure, resulting in a union more superficial than passionate. The couple did adopt a veneer of normalcy, appearing at red carpet events together, giving polished interviews in which they praised each other, and forging a public brand that seemed almost too glossy to be real. Those close to them paint a picture of two individuals who liked each other's company but rarely shared emotional intimacy. They lived in separate parts of the house or maintained fairly private lifestyles apart from each other. They never had children together, and some insiders have claimed that was by design. Neither wanted to compromise or shift their personal focus. When they finally divorced in 1951, the official narrative was that they had grown apart. No drama, no betrayal, just a drifting of two people who'd never quite clicked as soulmates. Despite the swirl of speculation, be it about his sexuality or her fiercely guarded independence, the pair stayed relatively civil afterward. They never publicly disparaged each other, and in that sense both upheld a certain old-school Hollywood code. Keep private matters private. Yet the marriage's end also reflected a turning point in Taylor's life. He was now truly on his own, personally and professionally. In the wake of the split, he would soon find himself embroiled in one of the most controversial chapters of Hollywood's mid-century era. To understand Robert Taylor's controversial stance before the House Un-American Activities Committee HUAC, we need a glimpse of the broader historical context. Following World War II, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated into what is commonly known as the Cold War. Fear of communist infiltration ran rampant, and in Hollywood this fear manifested in blacklists, loyalty oaths, and intense scrutiny of creative works for any sign of un-American propaganda. In 1947, HUAC began investigating suspected communist ties among film industry professionals, calling on actors, writers, directors, and producers to testify. Many big names, including Ronald Reagan and Gary Cooper, ended up on the witness stand. But Robert Taylor's testimony is often singled out for its directness. Unlike some colleagues who hedged or refused to name names, Taylor openly identified a handful of individuals he believed harbored communist sympathies. The immediate repercussions were staggering. Some of the people he named were blacklisted, losing their livelihoods for many years. Publicly, Taylor defended himself by claiming that he had little choice, that the pressure to cooperate was immense, and that refusing to comply could have spelled the end of his career. For many in the industry, though, that was a bitter pill to swallow. Others who faced HUAC managed to deflect or remain vague. Why had Taylor gone a step further and pointed fingers? In later interviews, Taylor attempted to distance himself from the naming names aspect of his testimony, insisting he was coerced or that he never intended for people to be blacklisted. Yet that did little to mend fences, especially with those on the political left. Some openly labeled him a stooge or a coward. Even those sympathetic to his plight acknowledged the moral complexity. If indeed he was forced by the powers at MGM to fully cooperate, how culpable was he? It remains a question that has no easy answer. What's clear is that Taylor's once pristine image took a hit. He was no longer just the perfect profile, but also a symbol of Hollywood's willingness to betray its own, real or perceived, under political and societal pressures. He became a poster child for those who believed the system was rigged to protect certain stars at the expense of others. The ironically tragic twist is that, despite testifying, he was never held up as some hero of anti-communist fervor. The government's anti-communist cheerleaders didn't celebrate him widely, and the left considered him suspect or worse. In effect, he was ostracized by both sides. A lonely position for a man who had often tried so hard to be liked by everyone. Looking back, that HUAC moment stands out as the clearest instance in which Taylor's lifelong pattern of compliance worked against him. Though he arguably upheld the studio's political alignment, MGM was generally conservative. He also undermined his own social standing in Hollywood's more liberal circles. To the public, the once gentle, romantic leading man was now forever attached to the era's ugly witch hunts and blacklists. And like many who found themselves entangled in the Red Scare, he carried that stigma to the end of his days. Despite the fallout from HUAC, Robert Taylor continued to work steadily through the 1950s and into the 1960s. To a surprising degree, fans who adored him for years seemed unconcerned about his political missteps, focusing instead on his enduring appeal. He went on to star in big productions like Quo Vadis, 1951, playing a Roman officer opposite Deborah Kerr, and Ivanhoe, 1952, with Elizabeth Taylor and Joan Fontaine. His image as a dashing figure in period costumes or Western attire kept him marketable, even if it never quite restored the sense of universal admiration he had once enjoyed. During this period, he found a measure of personal happiness by marrying actress Ursula Thies in 1954. Together they had 2 children, and by most accounts, a more conventionally harmonious home life than he'd had with Stanwyck. For a while, it seemed as though Taylor might settle into a more serene phase of life, less overshadowed by controversy, more content in his domestic setting. But the culture around him was changing. The studio system that had been his foundation for so many years was breaking apart. By the late 1950s and 1960s, television was on the rise, major stars were working independently of studios, and new cinematic trends like method acting brought a rawness that old Hollywood glamour no longer provided. Taylor adapted as best he could. He appeared in a television series, The Detectives, 1959 to 1962, which put him in the role of a police lieutenant. It was a smaller-scale project than the lavish epics of his earlier career, but it kept him in front of audiences and allowed him to stretch some dramatic muscles outside the big screen's constraints. Looking back, you can't help but wonder how Robert Taylor felt during this transitional period, having spent so much of his adult life as a product of the studio's protective packaging. Now, the environment was more fluid, competitive, and less forgiving to older actors who had thrived under the old system. In 1968, Taylor received a devastating diagnosis. He had lung cancer, which many attributed to his decades-long habit of heavy smoking. Co-stars and crew members from various films recalled him lighting up in between takes, a common habit of the era when the health risks of tobacco were less publicized or widely understood. The disease progressed quickly, and while he quietly sought treatment, he continued to work as long as possible, determined not to show vulnerability. Those who encountered him during this period have described him as calm, stoic, and resigned, keenly aware that his years of chain smoking had caught up with him. By the spring of 1969, it was clear that his health was in dire decline. The Hollywood rumor mill spun again, with some claiming that the studios and his publicists were trying to downplay the seriousness of his condition. But as the paparazzi snapped pictures of an increasingly gaunt Robert Taylor, the public understood that their beloved star was gravely ill. In June of that year, he passed away, leaving behind a film legacy spanning nearly 4 decades. His death was swift, overshadowed by the changing tides of Hollywood, where new stars and new controversies had taken center stage. So what do we make of this story? A life that bridged the glamour of the 1930s with the societal upheavals of the 1960s, culminating in a quiet passing that lacked the grand tributes often afforded to show business icons. For some, Robert Taylor stands as a cautionary tale of how external demands, studio systems, political climates, public expectations can shape and even suffocate an individual's personal desires. He was the man with the perfect face, the leading man in romance after romance, always exuding a certain calm and dignity. And yet, the real Robert Taylor, Spangler Arlington Brugh, remains elusive, overshadowed by a persona he rarely seemed to control. Friends recall him as a gentle soul, extremely conscientious, the type who would stand on set remembering everyone's name, from co-stars to stagehands. He wasn't the loud, brash type who fought the system publicly or championed personal creative visions. Nor was he the flamboyant star who wore his heart on his sleeve for tabloid consumption. Instead, he slipped through the cracks, beloved for his classical good looks but never fully recognized as a major acting talent by critics or the Academy. Indeed, despite the success of many of his films, he never secured even an Oscar nomination, one of those curiosities of Hollywood history. One lesser-known story that surfaced in an archived magazine interview involves Taylor's father, the country doctor. When Robert Taylor made his first real money in Hollywood, he reportedly sent part of his earnings back home to fund improvements in his father's clinic, paying for new equipment that would benefit patients in rural areas. It's a touching anecdote, one that underscores the inherent decency of a man often lost behind the bright lights. Another intriguing tidbit comes from the set of Westward the Women, 1951, directed by William A. Wellman. Several crew members later recalled that Taylor insisted on joining the rest of the cast and crew in some of the more strenuous tasks, hauling equipment under a grueling desert sun. When asked why, he shrugged and said he felt more like himself doing honest work rather than sitting in a trailer. These small glimpses into his character suggest a grounded, well-meaning individual who ironically ended up in one of the most artificial environments imaginable. By the time he was laid to rest in 1969, the Hollywood that had once polished him to perfection no longer existed. The old moguls were gone, replaced by younger executives interested in edgier films like Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde. The studio system was splintered. The social norms that shaped Golden Age Hollywood had dramatically shifted, and the so-called perfect profile was yesterday's news. Consequently, Robert Taylor's passing warranted respectful obituaries, but few tributes on the scale of some of his contemporaries. Some cynics suggested that even his death seemed stage-managed. He didn't want a big funeral or a media spectacle in keeping with his controlled public persona. The man who had once been inescapable on every marquee quietly vanished from the stage. So here, at the close of our journey through Robert Taylor's life, we find ourselves left with a mix of admiration, compassion, and perhaps a tinge of sadness. Admiration for the raw talent and genuine kindness that so many who worked with him describe. Compassion for the personal battles he faced, often hidden behind that perfect profile. And sadness for the sense that he may never have felt entirely free, living as he did under the demands of a powerful studio, a frenzied media culture, and the broader political tensions that engulfed Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.